Hello, welcome to Bumbling Through Dungeons. My name's Mark. Today we're talking about different types of experiments that you can do at your game table to find new and different and exciting styles of play. Let's get into it. So I'm a big fan of, and many of you may be familiar with, the idea of life experiments. Now, there are a lot of YouTube videos, there's probably whole subgenres that I'm not aware of people that do these sorts of things and then record what happens when they do a certain thing that is outside of their comfort zone for, it's usually like a month-long challenge, maybe 30 days. A lot of these have to do with like people's diets, and so there might be, I'm only going to drink water for 30 days, and then they record how hard is it? Do they fall off the wagon at any point? How do they feel? And then what are the cumulative effects? Did they lose weight? Do they feel better? Do they have more energy? Things like that. I've seen others where people will try to go an entire month without added sugars. So it's all natural sugars or sugarless foods. Sometimes this could be technological or social experiments. I see a lot where people will try to go 30 days without social media or without a particular website or websites, plural. And the goal is to try to get back some of their free time, work on more meaningful projects to them. So these are very interesting to me and I enjoy a lot of them. And I've tried some of them in my own life. And I think the concept can be applied to Dungeons and Dragons. I actually have a friend who's doing one of these experiments for an entire year. So he was never been into sports. He never was raised being a sports fan. So he's very ignorant of the sports world and he's been fine with that. But at a certain point, he said, all right, so many people are into this. They're fans. It's a big hobby. It's a big social thing for them. I want to see what it's about. I want to see if I'm actually missing out on something. So for an entire year, he decided he was going to be a sports fan. And for a lot of it, it's him faking being a sports fan, but he's actually trying to give it a full shot to see what it's like, to see if he finds a new outlet for his social life or, interests, whether it's television or whatever else. And whether or not it works, it's very interesting to me that he's willing to do this for an entire year. And I wouldn't necessarily say that most of these life experiments have to be done for that long. I think that's a bit much for many different experiments, but at the same time, a lot of these are done with the intent of creating long-term change. So you might drink nothing but water for an entire month, and at the end of that month, you're not just going to drink nothing but water moving forward, but you might drink a lot more water relative to what you did before that month. And I think that's an excellent use of these experiments as well. So I want to be clear that when I say that I think this concept can be applied to D&D, I'm not talking about anything disruptive. I'm going to give some suggestions, things that I've done at the table that were basically the equivalent of life experiments, but for the D&D table. But none of them I think were particularly disruptive, but it did get me out of my comfort zone. It did force me to do things that I might not otherwise do at the table, and it did get me to find different modes of play that I eventually found interesting and was able to incorporate into my long-term gaming. And I think the unit of measurement that is a D&D session, an RPG session, is a wonderful unit for doing these experiments. So you don't have to, say, try an experiment for an entire campaign. You can pick one session and say, I'm going to try this, and see what happens when you do that thing that maybe your character or you as a player wouldn't otherwise do. So what's an example of this? All right, so for one that I did, this was one of the earliest ones that I tried. I said, all right, I'm one of the more outgoing people at the table, and everyone had their say. No one was being overly shy, but I said, you know what? I want to take a back seat a little bit more sometimes and make sure that I'm letting other players have the spotlight for an appropriate amount of time. I don't ever want to hog the spotlight, and sometimes when you're in the middle of a session, it's hard to recognize whether or not you're monopolizing time. So I said, for an entire session, all I'm going to do is listen, and anything that I say will be a response to someone. So if I have something to say in response to their statement or their question, I will feel free to talk. But I'm never going to take the lead. And everything that I do will be responding to the world around me. So it was very much a session that I spent listening. and it was probably the least amount of talking that my character did and that I, Mark, did in a session for that entire campaign. And occasionally, after that session, I would think to myself, okay, let me just listen for a while. And I would enter that mode again, and I would form some thoughts and opinions in character that then would inform what my actions and my words later on in that session or in future sessions. So I think it was a very valuable tool, and all it took was one session of me saying, let me play in this slightly different way. And I doubt anyone at the table even noticed that I was doing it. So I'm going to have a few more examples that you can try, and there are undoubtedly way more that I haven't thought of. And as I think of more, I may come back to this topic. We may have another video on this at some point where I talk about new experiments that I've tried at the table. But I would love to hear ones that you come up with as well, because there are going to be more ideas, and your comfort zone is going to be different than mine. So finding ways to get out of that comfort zone is going to be different than what I need to do in order to push myself. So for another excellent example, and this is also one that I did, not right back to back with the earlier one that I mentioned, but it was very much the opposite of the let me listen and sit back and react to things. This was, I'm going to spend this session taking the lead, or at least attempting to take the lead in situations. So social situations, combat situations. So I want to be in the lead. I want to be the one who's the face of the party, talking on behalf of us. And sometimes this might end up stepping on a few toes, so you have to be careful. You have to know the dynamic at your table. So this is what I mean about not doing something that's going to be overtly disruptive. But I do think, even if, say, you're not a charisma-based character, and so you're not going to be the long-term face of the party for social interactions and things of that nature, that it's worth being able to step up in certain situations. So I think making a deliberate attempt over the course of a session or longer to say, you know what, I'm going to take on a little bit more of a leadership role with my character and see how that works out, see how it affects the dynamic at the table. And if you don't think it's working, you can step back from it, but you will have learned something. Another that I really enjoyed doing was to say, as I was going into a session, I said, I'm going to ask questions of my fellow players. So I think it was, this is a little while ago now, so I'm struggling to remember the exact number, but I think I said, I'm going to ask at least 3 questions of each other player at the table over the course of this session. So there were 4 of us in that campaign, so it was only 9 questions, but for someone who isn't necessarily a questioning character or person, this is 9 more questions than they may have asked otherwise. Now, what were those questions? Some of them were very simple questions. Some of them might have been related to the plot, but it was all in character. It wasn't Mark asking the other people at the table. It was my character asking the other characters at the table. And if you really think about what questions you want to ask, some of them might be very simple, and they might be plot related, and they might have very simple answers. But if you're able to find more interesting questions, you can start to get into the motivations of your fellow players. You can start to get into some backstory elements. You know, have you ever really asked the other players at your table in character about some of the elements of their backstory? Maybe you, the player, knows it, but not your character. And so there's opportunity to create more of a bond within the party, I think, in order to do this. And that's what I found too. So the characters weren't distant from one another before I did this, but in doing this, it brought up some interesting topics and made for some interesting in-character conversations. There are some others that are very contextual that I think can be interesting but aren't always going to be possible. So one of the things is maybe you play a martial or very warlike character, or maybe you always play very warlike characters. So if given a particular situation that you could fight your way through or talk your way through, your characters or you, the player, always chooses the fight option. So that may be more fun to you, and that may be what you want to continue to do long term. But what would it hurt for a session or two to say, all right, I'm going to give the social option a try. Now, because of contextual factors with your DM, with the situation in the adventure, with the other players at the table and the decisions that they make, you know, you may not end up being able to do this. You may try the social option and someone else may go running in, firing spells and swords and whatever else, and you may end up in combat anyway. But I think it's worth trying to experiment with balancing those two to see how you like the other side if you or your characters tend to be lopsided toward one or the other. So these are the types of experiments that I think can be beneficial at the table to you as a player and your characters in game, as well as the other players at the table. There are other experiments that I've done that are smaller and I'd say a little bit more arbitrary, but can also be a lot of fun, even if, again, nobody else knows about it at the table. So, for example, one session I picked a very arbitrary, somewhat odd phrase, and I said, I'm going to work this into my character's speech at least twice in this session. So you could pick a very strange word or odd phrase and say, regardless of what happens, I'm going to find a way to say this at least twice today. And finding ways to shoehorn that in, it's never going to derail a session. You're not going to anger anybody by doing this, but it's going to be a fun little mental exercise for you. And since I may get questions about what that word or phrase was, the word was jinkies, like the character Velma says in Scooby-Doo. Another is a very simple improvisational technique. I'm sure many of you who know things about improv theory know about yes and all this states is that if you're improving, one of the best strategies to do is whatever you're given by someone else, whatever they do or say, it's always a good decision, or usually a good decision, to say yes and to it. So whatever they give you, you don't shoot them down. You accept what they've done, you accept what they say, however goofy or unrealistic it may be, and you add something else onto it to make it more believable so that you're now collaborating on this together. So rather than just letting the other players have a goofy scene off to the side, you enter yourself in there and find a way to yes and it. So find a way to accept what it is that they're doing and add to it in a way that includes everybody, including yourself. So I've gone entire sessions where I'm trying to yes and everything that's given rather than being a skeptical or sarcastic character or a player who says, you know what, okay, you guys go off and do that thing. I'm not about that so much. But sometimes just going along with what the group's doing, even if it doesn't necessarily agree with your opinion on matters. Now, I think over a long period of time, there are some issues with yes and as a strategy that you always use, because it can create some really absurd situations that maybe are too far gone or too strange that you get to the point where nobody who worked together to create it is happy with it any longer. But as a spot strategy here and there, for a way to try to expand your improvisational horizons, I think it's a really fun technique. Something that I should note before I wrap this video up is that most, if not all of these, I think are particular to playing the game, not necessarily DMing and running the game. And the reason for that is there are so many different considerations as a dungeon master that saying you're going to yes and everything for an entire session, for example, can be problematic. More so than if you're a player. You can get your game really off the rails in ways that nobody at the table might want if you do some of these things. So I think you have to be a little bit more careful as a DM doing experiments like this. I won't say that it's not possible to do them as a DM, but I think you want to be a bit more careful about how you apply them and what ideas you come up with to try at the table. But if there's a takeaway from all of this, and I think there is, it's that all of these experiments, these life experiments or session experiments, are designed to analyze the game in different ways and get you to interact with it in different ways. I love doing these. When I think of a new one, I'm excited to try it out at the table because I know it's going to be a new, different experience for me. I might ultimately not enjoy it as much, but it gives me a new tactic for role-playing or combat or social encounters, whatever it applies to. I have a new way of approaching the game so that even if it's something that I do very rarely, it's still a tool in my player's toolbox, in my character's toolbox, that I can pull out when I think it is going to be interesting in a way that adds to the narrative. So tactics and strategies like asking questions and listening not only really benefited me the first time I did them, but they became regular parts of my play. So now there are times where I step back and I say, who haven't I gotten to know well enough? let me just find a side scene with them where I can talk to them and ask them a few questions, and maybe nothing will come of it, but maybe our characters come out of that scene with a stronger bond or a stronger understanding of one another's motivations, and that can create some really interesting dynamics at the table. So a lot of these have really helped my play. Some of them, like the arbitrary come up with a phrase and say it a few times, that's more just to have fun, but that's the point of the game, is to have fun. So I don't think that they're out of place in D&D, even if they aren't directly contributing to your skill as a player. So I hope that as you think about any that I've mentioned here or others that you may come up with on your own, it helps you to analyze your play. It helps you to analyze your role at the table as part of a collaborative group, and that through that analysis it deepens your understanding of how you can contribute. And if you have other ideas for cool experiments that you can do at the table as a player, please let me know. I would actually love to try some of them out, as long as, again, if they're not too disruptive, because this has been one of the greatest ways for me to learn as a player, and I'm excited to think of more and share them with you, and I would love to hear your ideas as well. So if you have any that you've tried or think of after watching this video, please let me know in the comments, and until next time, take care.